and also actively participate in this meeting. This conference, if you please, if I may make a few introductory remarks, this conference certainly marks very importantly not only the history of this conflict, but also everything to do with the Israeli-Palestinian or Jewish-Palestinian discussions regarding the attempts to formulate a narrative in regards to what occurred in the last 60 to 70 years of conflict. And I believe that the return to what happened to the days of 1948 is not only politically but also morally an obligation and a vital need for Israeli Jewish society, and it exists also in that matter in Palestinian society to return to what happened in 1948 and the willingness to what there was in 1948. And many injustices were done in that year, and the willingness to reconcile, to look differently at history, at what occurred in this brief history that we have here. And I think Israelis, if they think of returning to those days of 1948, I mean, in order to understand and grapple and learn with what happened, this can certainly help them come closer to the Palestinians and look at the past in a different light than was the norm previously. And attempts to present ideas in regards to the future of the area, the future of the two nations, the Arabs and the Jews, and everybody who live in this region. I think that these attempts to find alternatives, various alternatives, certainly different than those that are suggested by Zionism. And then this is important also for everybody who lives in this country, and also important as people who live in a geographic area that dream of a better future, dream of a better life for everybody, and to save ourselves from this doom that is nipping at our heels daily, and let go and get rid of the violence that is our mainstay, not only that things that are happening outside our houses, but also within our homes. And I think that this search for alternative solutions, such as the one state for two nations solution, which is based on democratic tenets and the aspiration for peace and equality and mutual respect for others, that is certainly and is something that can and this cohabitation, this is something that we should be for, and this is certainly a sign of progress in the many groups that are so concerned for their future and the concern for the future of us all. I think that these the forces can certainly found themselves on such tenets so that they can continue the fight for such ideals, for new alternatives that will replace this current bloody, difficult reality that we exist in. In this session titled State, Regime and Space, Return Where, we will listen to several conflicting opinions, each according to their experiences, their researchers from Israel and abroad that have spent many years of their lives and dedicated their lives to study and a lot of their personal lives to dealing with this issue and studying this issue, and also to find solutions to everything that's happening today. So I'm very, very glad and very happy and proud to produce the speakers And when they all start, I will introduce them individually. I'm glad to begin because I now have the honor of inviting the first speaker to speak about what he thinks about a binational Palestinian Jewish or a state, a local multicultural confederacy. And we will hear from Professor Jeff Halper. Jeff Halper is a coordinator in Israeli Society against the demolition of houses, and this will be the first to speak. And we will give him the opportunity to present his lecture. He gets 20 minutes, and we will try to make sure that we keep to the schedule. And I know some people will try to really, oppress that need and take too much time. But please, let's try and keep to the schedule. If you would, please, Professor Halper. Professor Jeff Halper is an anthropologist, coordinator of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, one of its founders, also a lecturer in various institutions, has studied peace, Israel, Palestine relations, and is active in various international bodies that address the issue of the conflict in the area. He has a very long biography that, of course, I kind of redacted into a few sentences. I'm sure that we're going to enjoy and learn a great deal from him.
First of all, I also want to acknowledge that we're on the lands of Palestinians who were displaced and driven out, and that this is the basis on which we're having this conference. I just came back from Australia. And in Australia, they have it's become a part of opening conferences and to acknowledge, in each part of Australia, to acknowledge the name of the group that lived on that particular land before and during the colonial period. So, and that would be something meaningful here, I think, in this country, if before every public presentation, before every conference and so on, we acknowledged not just the people, but the particular village and the, on which we're having our conferences. So that's something to think about in terms of beginning to get this consciousness into the everyday life of Israelis. I also want to really congratulate the Zochrot people for doing this conference, because this is exactly, I think, what's needed now. Politically speaking, we're stuck. And that is that I think probably the majority of people here, you don't even have to argue it anymore, understand that the two-state solution is gone. I mean, I don't even want to, I think we should stop talking about it, because it's simply confusing. When you talk about something that's dead, you're simply confusing the discussion. So I think we have to go on to there. But the problem is that it doesn't mean that the one-state solution is the default. It isn't an automatic going from one to the other. The Palestinians, for different reasons, and we have to follow the Palestinians' lead, themselves haven't completely shifted to a one-state solution. And certainly what kind of one-state solution, which is what I want to talk about today, is something that really needs to be fleshed out. So part of our job now politically is to begin to legitimize discussion about a one-state solution, and to begin to flesh out what do we mean by that. Do we mean a binational state? Do we mean a democratic state, one person, one vote, some other form of one-state solution, or another solution? And then, of course, once we begin to consolidate our ideas, we have to begin to strategize together in terms of how do we continue the political struggle. And the problem we have today is that we're in a political struggle with no end game. The two-state solution is gone, but like I said, the Palestinians themselves haven't completely shifted to a one-state solution. So this kind of a discussion in which the Palestinians play a key role in the discussion that give us direction is something that's really needed. And certainly a discussion that welcomes also critical Israeli voices is something that we need right now. Because, and somebody referred to it in the first panel, governments do not resolve conflicts. We have that idea that, you know, the governments are the leaders or whatever. They've arrogated to themselves the exclusive right to negotiate, to sign treaties. They're supposed to be running our international affairs, but they don't do it. And in fact, for governments, I believe, if the two-state solution fails, the default position is status quo, no solution. And they can live with that very well. No solution, we'll keep the status quo, we'll increase our governmental humanitarian aid to the Palestinians, and that's it. Because governments will not, I think, move on their own to a one-state solution or a solution that's just. That has to be pushed by civil society, by us. And if we don't come up with the formulations, if we don't decide what we want and begin to strategize together in terms of where are we headed, the governments aren't going to do it for us. And that's where I think a conference like this really plays a key strategic role in that discussion, and we have to continue the discussions. So what I'd like to do today, in the few minutes I have, is to start out with at least what I call an approach. I don't have a solution. I mean, I'm not here to give a solution to the, although we do have to begin to formulate where we're going. And I have some ideas. I want to try to be concrete, but I think before you get to solutions and concrete proposals, the first step is to talk about an approach to peace. What are the essential elements of any just and workable approach to peace? And this is good because this lays the foundations. In other words, if we don't agree on these principles, I mean, that's good, that's important, but at least it brings out what the disagreements are. Because it's only when we begin to agree on the foundations of a solution can we then move on to particular suggestions and structures. I would suggest, it was like Munir today, I don't know if it's 7 or 8 or 3, but at any rate, I would suggest, I have 7 essential elements that I think have to be present for any solution to work, any resolution of the conflict to work. I would suggest that if any of them are missing, it's not going to work. I don't care how good it looks on paper. And on the contrary, if all of these elements are present, there's a lot of different possibilities that begin to emerge that we can begin to play with. So that just very briefly, from my point of view, the issue at stake here, or the biggest issue that we maybe don't agree with today, certainly the Israelis don't agree with this, but also within the Palestinian community, there's the whole discussion about this, is whether or not we're living in a binational reality here. In other words, there are many Palestinians who over the last few years, especially in the left, have begun to adopt the settler colonial discourse. That Zionism is simply settler colonialism. It's simply a construct that has no legitimacy. There is no Israel. There are no Israelis. And in a Palestinian state, you can have Jews living here, but not as Israelis. And on the other side, of course, you have that same discourse on the part of Israel. The very basis of Zionism was an exclusive claim to the land of Israel, in which there is no Palestinian people. There's a bunch of Arabs, but they don't add up to a collectivity with national rights of self-determination. Now, whether or not the two peoples are able to recognize each other as national groups, I think is something that we're going to have to work out, because I don't see any other alternative. In other words, if we don't accept that the Palestinians are a people with national rights, it's a non-starter. obviously, but I think the other way is true as well, that we have to bite the bullet and say, there is an Israel, it exists, there is an Israeli people, and we're talking about a binational reality. And I'm saying this partly because there hasn't been much discussion yet about a one-state solution, certainly in the political realm. And the suggestions that have risen are kind of simplistic. It's one person, one vote, which sounds good on paper, but it ignores the national element. We're not just a bunch of voters from Kansas sitting in this country. We're talking about national struggles, national conflicts. The Palestinians have been 100 years in a national liberation struggle. I don't think they're going to settle just to be voters. And the other way around as well. Israelis simply reduce themselves to being individual voters. So I don't think one person, one vote is a model that fits, or at least it partially fits, but I'll talk about that in a minute. But the binational reality, I think, is the most important element here to either accept or to reformulate. And therefore, any peace has to be inclusive of both peoples. That you can't ignore the national identities or deny them. And secondly, we have to find a balance between collective rights of self-determination and individual rights of democracy. I'm not saying that one person, one vote isn't important, that democracy is not important, but these two things, and I'm going to suggest in a minute a kind of a way to try to put them together, they're both important elements. Obviously, any solution has to conform to human rights and international law, and that's been the fatal flaw of everything until now. Oslo, all the different processes that we can name from A to Z have taken out human rights and international law, which means that Israel wins if it's based on power negotiations. You have to have that to create a parity between Israelis and Palestinians in negotiations. The refugee issue that we've been talking about certainly has to be resolved completely. And here I just want to emphasize something that was touched on before, but that besides the actual settlement, the technical settlement, that Israel, a precondition in my view, is that Israel has to accept formally the Palestinian right of return. That this isn't some humanitarian gesture, because when Israel offered, with Barak's generous offer, 50,000, 100,000 Palestinian refugees to come back, it was presented as a humanitarian gesture. And that's completely unacceptable. The right of return is a right of return, and Israel has to acknowledge what it's done since 1948. Jews know that. Every time somebody gets up and denies the Holocaust. I mean, look what Rouhani's been going through over the last week, trying to prove to the world that he recognizes the Holocaust. I mean, that's obviously been done for political reasons, but the point is that victims need their suffering to be acknowledged. If it isn't acknowledged, then it's left open, it's festering. You can't close the issue with money or even with repatriation. So I think those two things those are the symbolic parts of this that are really crucial, and then you'll get down to the nuts and bolts of an actual settlement. Obviously, whatever emerges has to be economically viable, and I say that on the basis of South Africa. They got political independence, but certainly not economic equality between the communities. And we have to address the security concerns of Israelis and Palestinians and the entire region. And I think that we also have to look at a regional solution. I don't have time to get into that today, but I think Israel-Palestine is too small a unit to cram all the solutions into. You know, refugees, economic development, security, even water are regional issues. And now that this region is up in flames and so on, is actually in a certain way an opportunity. If civil society, if we begin to talk to each other and plan with each other, it creates a certain opportunity for us to rebuild the Middle East the way we would want to have it rebuilt. And so I think we have to begin to look at regional confederations, but I don't have time today to get into that as well. I think these are elements. Now, there might be more, and certainly I'm not saying they're all agreed upon. I'm not suggesting them as absolutes, but I think they at least lay a basis for creating a discussion among ourselves in terms of formulating where we're going, and so we're all sure that we're on the same page. If we can get through this stage, then working out the details is much less difficult. Now, just in terms of the details for a couple minutes, there's different models of what would work in this part of the world. In fact, the problem that we have in the Middle East, of course, is one of the problems is the imposition of European states that actually generate conflict. So that when we're thinking about a one-state solution, a two-state solution, why are we thinking about states at all, in a sense? Well, partly because that's the way the international system is structured. You have to, but I think we should try to get beyond states because I don't think they work anywhere very well, but they certainly don't work in the Middle East because European states are based on the principle of a strong state. The state is the repository of your identity. So if I ask Israelis who you are, you see, and that's where it doesn't work. The answer is, let me put it this way. If I ask a French person, who are you in terms of your nationality, as important as your religious background is, your ethnic background, you'll take out your passport and you'll say, I'm French. That's the state is a repository of your national identity. And citizens are then expected to be loyal to the state. The state belongs to its citizens, and citizens then take their identity from the state as well. Here, obviously, it doesn't work in Israel or in Palestine. So that what happens is that the state sees these, what is really most important, the ethnic, the religious, the political identities of people as something that's intermediate and is subversive. And actually in the Middle East, the traditional structure was based on ethno-religious communities. That's what embodied your civil status. You were a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew, and then within that, you had your rights. In other words, what in Europe was seen as subversive, having strong group identities, they were the building blocks traditionally in the Middle East. So as a model, I would suggest we have to begin to think of if we want to call it a state, something more on the lines of what's called a consociational democracy, sharing of power. And that is you have a weak state, something like Switzerland, or even Belgium, that is not the repository of your main identity. Your main identity is Israeli, Palestinian, those are the two major ones, and other types of identities, and they're validated and made strong, and then you have a group of citizens as well. But like in the Middle East, the whole focus falls on the groups themselves. And so, just in the 2 minutes I have left, this is kind of a model of what a consociational democracy might look like in Palestine-Israel. And that is you would have, the communities would be represented. You would be a part of the Palestinian community or a part of the Israeli Jewish community, and you also have individual citizens. In a way, this is very similar to some degree to the New Zealand model. And you would have direct elections by individual citizens to parliaments by constituencies, which we don't have in Israel today. And then each community would proportionally elect people to another house of parliament. So you'd have two houses of parliament, one communal, Israeli and Palestinian, to ensure that those collective, I'm saying that balance, those collective rights and collective identities are represented, and then also a House of Parliament that's directly elected by the people, the idea being to create a structure in which you're encouraging a process of the development in the younger generations of a common civil identity. But at any rate, both of them, the civil identity and and your national identity are represented. And in each house, you would have the laws passed, and they'd have to be passed by both houses and so on. And then you would have, like in Switzerland, a 3-member federal executive, which is a very weak technical administrative type of executive, of Palestinian-Israeli representatives, and then someone of the electorate. It's like in Switzerland there's 7. Here there might be 3, so that you have, on the administrative state level, you would have the representation, but really the building blocks of that society would be both the 2 communities in this country, and with a certain space for individual citizens. So I think there's models that could work. It's not a mystical kind of a thing, but again, the most important thing before you get to that is to agree on the approach, on the basic. It doesn't matter. I lost it here. On the basic, here, this one, is to agree on this approach. So I'll leave it at that. Can I what?
Is Professor Terry Rempel from the Exeter University in England. It has a long name, looking back, looking forward, transitional justice, comprehensive plans of action, and Palestinian refugees by Dr. Terry Rempel. So many topics in one title. Now I'd like to invite Professor or Dr. Terry to speak.
مستقل وباحث شرف في جامعة إكستر درس وبحث في التاريخ
I'm sorry, I'm not getting the interpretation.
نشر سلسلة من المقالات حول اللاجئين الفلسطينيين وهو
He published several topics on Palestinians, and he is one of the founders of the Badil Center that takes care of the rights of Palestinian refugees.
Thank you to Zahrat for the invitation. Although once I received the title of the panel, I got a little bit nervous. The title I've given you for the presentation is also long, and I feel I have a bit daunting task to try to squish in some material, but also provide a narrative between 3 different themes that I would like to explore, based drawing on the title of this panel. So what I would like to do, try to do very briefly, is to provide some, first of all, initial thoughts on some of the problems raised by the panel's theme. I think it's a very interesting title for this panel. Secondly, to present a possible framework. We've heard 2 different approaches. I would like to start looking at a framework from a refugee law and practice perspective. It's not a plan, but rather a set of principles around which a plan can be constructed and filled in. And then I would like to turn to the issue of transitional justice and examine, or more simply raise some questions about the potential role of transitional justice in this framework that I will present. And finally then return to the set of problems raised, I believe, by the title of this panel. Now, in starting off and saying looking back, looking forward, I use that in kind of 3 different senses. First of all, as you may know, this is one of the phrases that defines what makes transitional justice different from other types of justice. It's backward-looking, but also forward-looking sense. Now, in terms of what I'm looking at, comprehensive approaches to refugee situations, there was a recent article on comprehensive approaches, and it was titled Back to the Future. And it's back to the future in the sense that they're looking at ideas from the 1980s and early 1990s and trying to see what can be learned and applied in the current context of refugee situations around the world. And finally, I'm looking back and forward in terms of approaches to how to resolve the situation of Palestinian refugees. I should lastly say quickly that part of what I'm presenting here is part of a larger and ongoing research project, and share credit with the ideas with Susan Akram, who is clinical law professor at Boston University. So section 1, to start off, and focusing in on the title of this session, which I think raises two interesting, at least two, and perhaps some more interesting comments, which I'll just problems, which I'll just briefly touch on. The title, State, Regime, Space, Return to Where, or when I was thinking of it, I reversed this around and said return to where, and then began thinking about state, regime, and space and what that implies. And I think it draws quite well attention to two interrelated aspects, unresolved aspects of the issue concerning the future of Palestinian refugees and other displaced Palestinians. On the one hand, there's the question of return to home, to one's home of origin. On the other hand, there's the question of return to homeland. And each of these involve a range of legal, political, practical, and other types of issues and dimensions, most of which remain sources of dispute and have raised many different, in the last 10 years, approaches to try to address them. The title, I think, also suggests a certain sequencing in the sense that return to homes seems to be dependent on resolution of the issue of return to homeland and what that means. And that's a dual sense as well, both in terms of, in the current political situation, of an unresolved occupation, military occupation, and a conflict over the character of the State of Israel, which is opposed to the return of large numbers of Palestinian refugees. Addressing both aspects, individual then and collective, i.e. return to homes and return to homeland, arguably comes also more complicated in the context of what is a very protracted and one of the most protracted situations of forced displacement in the world. There's been multiple waves of displacement that continue, different categories. While most of the attention focuses on 1948 and 1967 refugees, there's the internally displaced, but also there's ongoing internal displacement in the West Bank, and there's new categories that come up. For example, during the Gaza war, the idea of internally stuck people. They cannot flee anywhere during situations of conflict. There's the issue of time and physical changes to homes of origin and homeland. And over time, a layering of identity or identities and place-based attachments within and between generations of refugees. This growing complexity of the situation, however, is not solely a function of the conflict itself. It is arguably shaped and reshaped over time by external factors. For example, the issue of practice in other cases during the 1990s when negotiations, the Oslo process started and was moving towards final status negotiations in 2000, 2001. Very little attention was given to the fact of the implications for how refugees perceive home and homeland of other large-scale mass returns that were happening at the time, and the very different set of principles that were raised, and draw out issues relating to legitimacy of the solutions that were being advocated at the political level among negotiators for Palestinian refugees. Another example is the issue of changes in migration, both forced and voluntary, and the ways in which migrants, again, both forced and voluntary, are able to maintain and sustain multiple connections to homes and place-based attachments. And finally, what I've already mentioned and alluded to is the fact that if you put refugee agency or choice at the heart of finding a solution to the refugee issue, and allow for self-definition of the meaning of home and homeland, these concepts become much more, again, complex, nuanced, and evolve over time. And while this may create a certain complexity, I think it opens up opportunities to think in new ways about solutions and the way refugees themselves conceive of a solution to their situation. So moving then on to a possible framework. we just heard two presentations about political frameworks. I would like to start at a step back and look at a framework from a refugee law perspective. It is not a plan, as I said, more of a set of principles upon which a plan can be constructed and filled in. It might be described as a rights-based approach to the refugee issue, although I would caution on this kind. I think that it's, and I've used it myself, a good description between rights-based and political or power-based approaches. But I think there are important lessons to be learned about each approach and the ways in which each uses law and power, and how those can be used in order to promote an equitable solution to the refugee issue. So then what I would like to focus on and briefly describe are what is generally called comprehensive plans of action. Comprehensive plans of action, which emerged, like I said, in the late 1980s, mostly in Indochina and also Central America, were designed to deal with regional refugee situations. And there have been growing interest in the last 5-10 years to revisiting these approaches to deal with increasingly protracted situations of forced displacement around the world. Forced displacement that is longer in time, but also larger numbers of peoples per case. Comprehensive plans of action have been said to have three basic characters or elements, which define them as being comprehensive. First of all, they are comprehensive in the sense that they strategically and use in a mutually reinforcing way all the three durable solutions that are afforded to refugees, namely the right of return, local integration, and third country resettlement, based on two principles: non-refoulement, that is the rejection of the forced return of refugees to situations where their lives are at risk and they are not safe, and secondly, refugee choice is the foundational principle for these solutions, that people should not be forced into any one of the solutions, but should have an actual and real choice. They're also comprehensive in the sense that they deal with all categories of refugees and displaced persons, not just one particular group or one particular group in a particular host country. And they also address in that context in a holistic way the situation of host and stayee communities, i.e. non-refugees in countries where either refugees will choose to return or where they will choose to stay. Now, to give you just a brief example how this works, they are comprehensive in the sense that in Indochina, it was Vietnam's decision to take back the refugees who had fled from Vietnam, which had previously rejected. That opened up opportunities for other states in the region to say, okay, we will take a certain number to reintegrate who choose to stay. And Western states agreed to resettle on a time basis those who did not want to stay in the region. It was all three solutions being on the table, all three offers. If one of the states took off one of those offers, the other two solutions would collapse. So it was important to have all those available solutions for refugees to choose from. The key lesson from that, however, from both the cases in the 1980s, is the importance of a viable country of origin. Without a country from where refugees originally fled, allowing them to return, a comprehensive approach was simply not viable. Secondly, the second element of it is that they were cooperative. They involved all the major state actors, from the country of origin to the host country to the resettlement country and donors, based on the principle of equitable burden or responsibility sharing. And thirdly, they were collaborative. They adopted a multi-sectoral approach, i.e. they worked at the political, developmental, security, peace-building level, and they also worked across international, regional organizations and non-governmental organizations, which played an increasingly important role in facilitating solutions. These approaches have also been said to have three basic stages. A first stage, initial stage, following some kind of political agreement to move forward, is a stabilization phase, where you provide You're working on refugee protection and establishing a dialogue among the major stakeholders in order to move towards a negotiated solution to the conflict and to set up a comprehensive plan of action that's going to define how the refugee situation will be resolved. This phase, the signing of the agreement, is the second phase, and the negotiating of the details of the comprehensive plan of action. And then it moves in towards implementation and longer-term rehabilitation and reintegration of refugees. The question then is, can this type of framework be applied to address the situation of Palestinian refugees? What I've been working on is mapping out what needs to be done at each different stage, and then looking at the kinds of things or foundations that already exist here among states, among civil society, in the region at large, among international actors, and identifying the gaps. What's missing? What needs to be done? And to determine potential strategies. The key problem that we have, of course, is the lack of a viable country of origin and to which refugees are allowed to return. So how do you move beyond that? I'm going to skip some and move to the last section then in terms of looking at the possible role of transitional justice. Like comprehensive plans of action, there has been growing interest in recent years in transitional justice and displacement. There's a really interesting volume that the International Center on Transitional Justice published. It's available online. It's a book, but you can download the entire book. And it looks at all the different elements of transitional justice and how it can be used to address forced displacement. So I won't go into all those details, which are explained very well in that volume. But what I'd like to do is simply raise some questions for consideration in terms of looking at transitional justice and how it might be used to reshape interests and look at identities in a new way that could facilitate a solution to the refugee issue. First of all, I think context is important. Transitional justice, if you divide it into the two words, it raises two questions. Transition to what? It emerged, transitional justice, the idea looking primarily first at transitions from authoritarianism to democracy, later applied from conflict to peace, and more recently has looked at also transitions to new dispensations. Arguably all three apply, could apply in this case, and understanding what kind of transition is important in terms of looking at the mechanism and what kind of mechanisms might be useful. Secondly, justice, and what does that mean in terms of forced displacement? Does it mean violations that led to displacement, violations as a result of forced displacement, the crime of forced displacement? Should it focus on civil rights, or should it also focus on socioeconomic rights, political rights? Should it be retributive, restorative, or redistributive, individual or collectively focused? When one puts this in the context of a comprehensive approach to refugee situations, which involve all the countries of origin, all the countries, major stakeholders, all the solutions, one has to be then looking at, should transitional justice simply be limited to Israel-Palestine? What about the situation of refugees who may choose to remain in the state where they are currently residing? The situation in Syria raises serious questions around this. Will refugees be able to go back if and when there is a solution to that conflict? And will their situation be the same, the relations with Syrians be the same as they were before? Will transitional justice measures be needed in order to facilitate effective and long-term integration if they so choose to stay? It also raises the question of stages. Transitional justice is usually applied in a post-conflict stage. Can it be used to, in effect, facilitate a transition in the context of ongoing conflict? What are the risks and challenges posed by that? It raises a question then of who is the initiator of transitional justice? What is the role for civil society? Who are their potential partners? And And it raises the issue, finally, of transitional justice, then, in that context, needs to address three basic factors. It needs to be preventative, either in the sense of trying to prevent ongoing displacement. It needs to be environment building in the sense that it needs to promote new ways of thinking about how to resolve the conflict. And it needs to be remedial, in its classic sense, in terms of addressing the past. Now, I think all three, and I have two more comments to make in 2 more minutes. It's excellent. So I think all the traditional forms of transitional justice, from prosecution, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, reparations, which we heard about this morning, all have a potential role to play. Some general principles to guide that are they should be used in a complementary fashion. They need to be context specific, but also there's some thinking around sequencing and which mechanisms are used when in a process. But return involves, the issue of resolving refugee situations involves more than simply active mobility, whether it's going home, staying in your place of refuge, or going to a third country. It is a much larger process that involves the progressive establishment of conditions that contribute to individuals and communities being able to effectively exercise social, economic, civil, political, and cultural rights. How then do you address that in a transitional justice context? There has been some emerging research that looks at also what has been called participatory constitution building as a transitional type process. And I just want to unpack those three terms as my last comment to clarify what I mean by that. But participatory, of course, it means, in a sense, a bottom-up approach that looks at, in terms of constitution building, moving on to the next element, issues beyond return, restitution, and compensation. Issues that begin to disaggregate identity, realizing that beyond ethnic, national, religious group identities, people have other group and layered identities. It may be concerns about labor, employment. It may be concerns about gender. It may be concerns about health or education. By working on those, and it maybe draws on some of these ideas of equity, equality projects, by working on these, is it a way to build a new kind of dispensation, whether that's one state or binational state, but by working on these in a disaggregated issues that will also help in the long run of facilitating long-term reintegration of refugees, whether that's to their places of origin or applying a similar type of process for refugees who may choose other solutions.
شكرا. شكرا جزيلا لتيري رامبل. احنا المفروض تكون يعني استراحة لربع ساعة، بما انه احنا متأخرين ربع ساعة، فاجت يمكن على حساب اللي حابين يسألوا أسئلة.
Sorry, I cannot get the interpretation.
القسم الثاني من هذه الجلسة راح يكون في مجال أيضا لطرح أسئلة وكذلك لمناقشة. لهذا السبب يعني اسمحوا لنا إنه اللي عنده كم سؤال ولا إشي نأجل لبعد الجلسة الجاي حتى نناقش الأسئلة ونطلع كما هو مقرر للاستراحة. أهلا وسهلا مرة أخرى، ونواصل بالجلسة الثانية ونستمع إلى 4 مداخلات، كل مداخلة حوالي
15 minutes will be left for questions and remarks at the end, some of the time. Some of the previous session, in most of the people who were here in the second session are here as well in the second part of the second session, but even though the speaker may have left, we can still present the question that was asked, and you are welcome to do so. You are welcome to ask questions in this second part of the session. We will begin with the sad fact that sometimes in this country almost anybody can come here except for the people who are from here themselves. People get a visa and they say to him ahlan wa sahlan, meaning hello and welcome. People come to meet this person in the airport and say welcome to Israel. But if a Palestinian like Salman Abu Siti comes here, or even for a visit, not just to live, to come to Beersheba, he is not allowed to enter and come and visit in Beersheba like the other Palestinians in abroad. So this does not stop us from speaking with such a person of experience and enormous prestige as he is, writing of this country, and certainly it will not stop us from listening to his lecture using the new technologies. Salman Abu Siti will talk about, Amar will present him, and then we will hear his lecture via video.
موجزات ثم نرى محاضرته على الشاشة فيما بعد. تفضل.
אוקיי, ההרצאה שאנחנו נראה כאן שסלמן אבו סיטה ייתן בכנס זה, כמו שאתם רואים, הוא לא יגיע פיזית. אנחנו מתנצלים על הבלבול.
We are very sorry for the confusion in the program. It didn't say that is a video movie. It wasn't written in the English and Hebrew programs. This was a lecture that was given in April in Boston University, as you can see on the plaque on the days here. And when the publication regarding his appearance was aired, we contacted him and he asked us to also present this lecture to this specific audience, mixed international Israeli Palestinian audience, and he thought that this was exactly appropriate because this is what was in Boston as well. He's a Palestinian researcher that was born in Beersheba. He is a refugee of Beersheba. His family went all the way to Cairo, where he continued his studies, and he studied civil engineering. Later he moved on to London and continued his engineering studies there, and established with other Palestinian and British collaborators the British Palestinian Engineers Association. The value or contribution of his research is in mapping out the Palestinian world, including all the Palestinian villages which were either overtaken or destroyed in 1948. He also mapped out for the first time, we believe, this orderly arrangement of settlements both in English and Hebrew. His research began, so he writes in one of his articles, at the age of 30, when he found a diary, a memoir of the Turkish officer in the city of Beersheba that was at the time under the regime of the Ottoman Empire. And in this diary, beginning its date in the 19th century, this is where this is the day, finding this diary is the day began his studies, and he has not yet stopped since. Understanding the history of the Palestinians from 1948 onwards, there's a fantastic atlas that he compiled just recently, which is called Through the Seven de Chashiva, where he gives you all of the 7 key Palestinian settlements that were until 1948, and layers of the country of Israel from 1948 that could be helpful for anybody today who wants to be interested, who is interested in such facts.
Injustice has a short life, and justice will always prevail in the end. I don't need to tell you about the virtues of principles such as justice and what it entails. I don't need to tell you that racism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and all that is evil, although sometimes we have to preach this to other people. Also, I don't need to tell you that colonialism is also an evil which has subsided to a large extent, except in Palestine. But what I'd like to present to you today, some relevant facts, which presumably would help you to form, not an opinion, you already have one, but to form the body of the crime which befell the Palestinians. And not only that, we know most of the facts about this, although the details about 1948 is by far not yet recorded. But we want to derive from this something else. We want to say, this is the crime, we described it, we actually outlined it and examined its elements. The next question is, what to do about it? We must reverse it. And this is the duty which is now before us. And my case is very clear. They took away my home by force at gunpoint, and I want it back. I'm determined to get it back. This is my case, but it's also the cause of 12 million Palestinians. I would like you to look at this slide carefully. Today is April. 65 years ago, on this day, on this week, many important things happened. And in the following 6 weeks, from today to 14th of May, 6 weeks, they determined the future of the area, or the problems of the area, or the wars in the area as we see today. These blue areas, blue dots here, represent the Palestinian villages which have been depopulated at this time. 220 villages were depopulated in this period. Half of all the refugees were expelled from their homes at this time, before Israel was established, before the British left, before any Arab soldier came to rescue the Palestinians. That tells you the story of who was defending and the defense, and who was attacking. Every single operation of Israeli conquest of Palestine, 31 operation, has been preceded by and interspersed by at least one massacre. And these massacres were intended to, of course, to terrorize people and force them to leave. This is the nature of the situation we faced. Here it is, 1,100 towns and villages in Palestine. They lived peacefully in their land for many centuries, and then the Nakba came, so suddenly the Palestine was empty. 675,000 villages and hamlets and locations have been depopulated within 6 months after the establishment of the State of Israel. Where are they now? They are scattered in 602 registered places, according to UNRWA. They are, of course, dispersed in more places than that. Now, people sometimes talk about Gaza, it's very crowded. Nobody bothers to ask, why is Gaza crowded? These red dots are 274 villages which have been depopulated and crammed into 8 refugee camps in Gaza. That's why Gaza is crammed. Why is it so heavily populated? Because it is the place where the population of 274 villages in southern Palestine have been located in this one. And therefore, we defined what the problem is, we defined what the crime is. We have now to think in new terms. We have to solve that. We have to find a solution. We have to make a remedy of this. Remedy, as Max explained, has been taking place in Abkhazia, in Uganda, in Bosnia, everywhere. Why not in Palestine? Now, we must really work hard, all of us, to do this. We must reverse the ethnic cleansing. Of course we must do that, and this will happen. But people say, yes, it's really correct and it's human, But you know, your country now is full of people, and your villages are destroyed, and even refugees themselves are dispersed everywhere. We don't know where they are. But I'll tell you something. Even if all this is true, this doesn't in any way diminish from the right of return. Even the whole place. It doesn't diminish. It's your home. It's your home. It doesn't diminish that the occupant has brought in his friends and cousins and built probably a second story and all that. No, it doesn't. But I tell you, it is not true. Even that is not true. Let us see how it is. Do we know the people, the Palestinians? Yes, we do. We know where they are from. Here is the village called Al-Jiyya, just north of Gaza. We know where the people of Al-Jiyya are residing now, in these blue circles. Take another one, another village. Beit Mahsir. This is just west of Jerusalem. We know where the people of Beit Mahsir are now residing. Take another one in the Galilee, Safuriya. We know their names and their children, their wife and their brothers and so on. We know where they are. Now, we can do this in reverse also. We can look at a refugee camp in Jabalia, for example, and we know where these people come from in Jabalia. When we have, as Ziad today, we have trucks and buses for people to go back to their home, and these buses stand at Jabalia camp. We know they come from these villages. And we also, those in Dahisha camp, where is Ziad? He's here. He can know where the villages they come from. And Ain al-Hilwa, and so on. So we have no problem. We have a database of 6 million Palestinians. We know where they are, we know their property, we know where they come from, we know their uncles and so on, and where they are residing today, waiting for return. But then the next question is Israel crowded? There is no place for people to go there to return? I told you, of course, if it is true or not, even if it was true, that is not a good reason. But we made this analysis. Israel has 46 natural regions, they call them, and we analyzed them one by one, and we found that 84% of Israeli Jews live in 17% of Israel area. 84% live in 17%. Who lives in the 84% of Israel? Few kibbutz and the army. I'll explain that. Let me give you this picture, which I think is very interesting. We just detailed every Palestinian village land, who lives there today, and how many kibbutz, and what kind of settlements are there, and in reverse, where are the people who own this village land, where they are today. These areas, which you see in blue, these areas, in these areas, 80% of Israeli Jews live in 4% of Israel area. These are 49 Israeli localities out of about 1,000. What does that tell you? 49 localities out of 1,000 have 80% population. It means there are so many other localities which are, tiny places, which are kibbutz mostly. So, therefore, the question of the place is full is not right. I would like to examine in detail an area which is subject of news so much. Here, for example, this one is always doing the right thing. Here is Jerusalem, and here is Tel Aviv, Jaffa, and this is Gaza. In this slide, the red dots are the depopulated Palestinian villages. What happens when they were expelled? The blue area is the Israeli urban expansion today. So you can see the extent of this Beersheba, this Al-Majdal, this is Dud, and the rest almost empty. Who used this land? Jewish National Fund took this land in order to build kibbutz on it. Now, what they are using it for, this is the use of this area today. The red dots are strategic military points, and the yellow area is closed military area. This closed military area, and these are strategic military points. There are very few people living in this area. As I'll explain it even a bit more. So obviously Israel is a huge military base. It's the largest military base between Paris and Beijing. It's a huge military base with people there manning it as people, as national of this country. If there is peace, if we do not need these military bases, we can actually rebuild our Palestinian villages in the same locations with no obstruction to the existing urban expansion. Take, for example, the southern district of Palestine. All rural Jews in that area are less than one refugee camp. This is the present occupants in the southern district. And when the refugees in Gaza return, they can return to their places without any conflict of any place with anybody. And you can see they actually can walk home. Now, this is fine. So that's the population, and we know the land. We will do one step more. We are not going to just show plans and all that. We'll take one more positive step. And this more positive step, we have now a project, we're working on it. We want to document the destroyed Palestinian villages. We want to know, make maps of the houses of these villages and who owns each single house. And so that we can then redesign the village again. Of course, we have increased 8 times, and we are going to enter into international competition among Palestinian architects who will redesign their own villages on the same location and for the same population, but with decreased numbers. So we divided Palestine into 10 areas. Each area has a significant village design. Why? Because of the terrain. For example, here, this is Hula Valley, and then here, Upper Galilee Hills, and here, Akka Acre, here, Haifa Acre, and so on. Each one of those areas, we designed it so that the village design in this area is uniform. It belongs to the same characteristics, weather, height, terrain, building materials, and so on. And as an example, we have aerial photo 1948 of Beit Jirja, this Beit Jirja, and we actually marked the houses in the village, and we know the names of the owners of these houses, and we repeat this same process to other villages. And actually, when you think of the reconstruction of these villages, it's not a difficult task at all, because here is the amount of labor we need, here is the amount of money, here is the amount of unit. We need only 1.5 million units, which are much less than what Palestinian engineers built in the Gulf and Saudi Arabia. So it's not a big deal, and we have the labor for it. And let me tell you one thing. Examine, for example, the money paid by the United States to Israel, $133 billion, plus the hidden amounts. Think of the money paid by European Union to Israel. Think of all the expenses which have been a result of the war since 1948. Add this number, you get some number, I don't know how much, but let us say $800 billion. I bet you with 1/10 of this amount, we can rebuild Palestine. 1/10 of this amount. And it's only once. It's only once. It's not a drain on the United States budget, which is in terrible state at the moment. It's actually once. Otherwise, the tap will remain open. So there is no escape from the fact that we have to implement the right of return. And from all this, let me conclude by saying the UN reaffirmed the right of return 135 times. So we have no problem, as you see, neither from logistic or legal or population or land or property or economics or geography or history. We have no problem with that. We should never, ever lose hope in justice. There is no question that justice will ultimately prevail. I'm only asking you to keep faith in justice and let us work together to make the time for justice implementation sooner rather than later. Thank you very much.
نأمل في أحد الأيام أن نلتقي دكتور سلمان.
Quite frankly,
التقى في خارج البلاد يعرف هذا الرجل كيف يعمل وكيف ينشط ليس فقط في موضوع حق العودة.
he will show us how he is active and how he works not only in terms of the right of return, but also specifically in his enterprise to create peace in the region and so that we can save ourselves from the current situation. The next lecture is titled Return is the Key to One Democratic State. We will be hearing from Ofra, the last book that she wrote, Why Israel Doesn't Have a Democratic a Jewish State. It was published in 2011. She used to be the Ma'ariv in Washington correspondent. She was active in international relations in this field and works for one democratic state, and one of the founders of the Jaffa group that also is working for this one state solution. Thank you so much. Let us hear from Ofra. First of all, thank you to Zahora to having established this amazing conference and is giving a right to speak also for our group. I've heard from Allegra and I was a bit frustrated. It's true that we're not establishing a mass movement. That's true, but you have to start somewhere, don't you? And we have started and we do exist and we've been around for almost a year. And I think this is also an opportunity. We're going to talk about the group, but I am also going to talk about a few of the issues that we are so concerned about. This issue of a democratic Jewish state, a secular state, is not a new issue, certainly. Since the very turbulent discussions of the partition plan, certainly the Palestinian state was almost, of course the Palestinians were almost 100% against it, but let's not forget that there were also many people, many factions within the Jewish community, important as well, who didn't think that it was a good thing to divide this land according to an ethnic and or religious division, something that we believe should have been done. We believe that this was the right thing to do. Let's not forget that this was after the Holocaust, 1947-48. Most of the Jews living here believed that they needed their own state, a Jewish state for themselves. Our position is that this reality did not prove itself in the last 65 years. And the idea of one state, this vision, remains as a PLO kind of mentality, something that was talked about a great deal in the UN. In 2008 in Haifa, there was maybe the first of its kind convention about the one-state solution. There was also another one in 2011 that talked about this. Some of us participated in such conventions. There are also a few initiatives in London, in Houston, in Texas, in Madrid, and so forth. This issue is constantly under the surface. I don't think there's even a single speech today that didn't deal with it directly or indirectly. And by the way, in terms of articles and newspapers in Israel, specifically in the Haaretz newspapers, they talk about how dangerous it is that there's going to be one state, but they never talk about the advantages. There was one initiative in Munich about a year ago in order to unify all of the people working towards this, because we all come from various places, various associations and organizations, to see if we can build a sort of pan-organization, a coalition that we can talk about the core tenets that we all hold dear together, and perhaps try to begin that mass movement that we believe should be in reality. And after the Munich convention, two people began being active here in the Palestine-Israel area. There was a Bethlehem meeting, there was another one in Ramallah, and the group that's thus far has been most active for which is less than 40 people who have come to meetings on a regular basis, and surprisingly most of them from the Jewish side of the aisle. I think it's not particularly surprising, because I think Palestinians generally, this idea, although it's appealing to them, they don't really see how practical it could be. We are people with a great deal of experience and background from varying places, but I think we did manage to draft a manifest which is on the internet, and I suggest that you see it. I couldn't bring it all in its completeness, but the relevant points for this meeting are that we adopt a one-state solution. We believe that this is the only just solution, and it includes and ensures the return of the Palestinian refugees and an end to any kind of apartheid mentality here in Israel. And we think that this is also the best solution for the Jewish community in Israel. But we do not think that we can even think about any kind of solution for anybody here in Israel, including the refugees, that unless everybody is participating in this new country and shaping its new political regime, the one that we want to see here, and the ones that we want, the kind of society that we want, the egalitarian society that we want to institute here. And this is a vision that, at least to me personally, I believe that Jews who always think that they're persecuted and so forth, I think they can connect to that idea as well. Now, I don't come from the world of the academic world, and I'm certainly not going to give you a clear kind of understanding of the articles of this contract, but I can talk about various aspects of reality, of the Hanakba, of the refugees. I mean, we all got a booklet of Zohot about Sheikh Munis. There was a very flourishing village here. The picture that you see is from 1923. It was by the Reuven, the artist. It was part of a collection, a privately held collection of Ami Brown, which was just exhibited in Harod 2 or 3 years ago, and later on, after the exhibition was dismantled, it was sold in the Tirosh Gallery. It was so thrilling that it was even sold for over $200,000, and it was sold actually at the end for $400,000 or $500,000. Now, people survived for this. Now, Sheikh Munis in 1923, what a beautiful painting! How lovely! The person who bought it is maybe a Russian oligarch that maybe is some sort of Zionist, I don't know, but it is a painting of how Sheikh Munis looked. So our ability as the Jews in Israel to completely ignore, to take the Nakba, or to take the past of this place and not even be disturbed by it, is a bit impressive, actually, almost in its own fashion. And I'm going to move on to another small anecdote that has to do with that. This house is right across the street. I used to live on the Shayagnon on the corner. One day I started walking on the Ramat Aviv hotel grounds just before it was demolished, and I saw this amazing, gorgeous old house. I took pictures of it. I mean, I was interested, what is this house? I mean, who lives here and so forth? And I was told in the hotel that this is about to be demolished because they're expanding Ramat Aviv. I say, how can this be? That was over 10 years ago. And I said, how can this be? This is a historic building. Tel Aviv has all sorts of preservation rules. Try to do something in your apartment. If you have a historic apartment, you would not be allowed in a million years. I thought, how could, and let's begin this campaign against the demolitions of such a house. And this is how I began. I reached Eitan Brunstein, who was at the time abroad. And really thanks to him, he very quickly managed to take this picture, and immediately media coverage started pouring in, and people started talking about it, and there was the first walk protest by Zechot at the time where they tried to walk about this. And then I got a phone call a week afterwards, maybe 2 days after a news article, and that they said that the house is going to be demolished. And I managed to take pictures of the tractor demolishing this beautiful house. And when we came in the patrol at the end of this week, you could only see the broken stones and the remnants of the house, and maybe have a very thrilling meeting with Jail Ubidas, who told us the story of this house. And after about a year, I got a phone call from the Amoved publication house, and they said that they wanted to write about 40 buildings in Tel Aviv. And they told me, we understand that you are the only one has a picture of this house before it was demolished. Can we use the picture? We're going to give you the credit. I said, sure, I'll send you the picture. And I also told them the story. And I said, look, it's a house that was demolished. If you're talking about preservation, I want you to talk about the demolition as well. After a year, they called me and they said, we're really sorry. We forgot to give you credit, but we'll send you the book. And then I saw, and I really did get a book and a lot of chrome sort of color pictures. And then they have this, the Bet Sheikh Bidas house. And I'll tell you what it says in the bottom. The house of the Arab Sheikh Bidas, demolished after 1948. See the incredible ability. First of all, it's not a lie. 2003, which is when it was actually demolished, is in fact after 1948. In fact, it was, they said the truth. The house was in fact destroyed after 1948. The fact that it wasn't destroyed after 1948, but rather in 2003, is something that they didn't mention. But this is astonishing. We're talking about psyche. We're talking about awareness. We're talking about how people think. How we can explain to the Israeli population all sorts of things, how we will explain the Nakba to them. Well, first of all, we have to know where we stand, because I'm not optimistic. I think it can be done, certainly, but this blurring of memory is something that happens on a daily basis, and it continues. It's ongoing. If you see the Haaretz newspaper article just recently, this ability and the need of the Jews to entrench themselves into one group, which is typified by this old and fascinating and wonderful religion of Judaism that belongs to us all, and that's fine. But it's not incidental that there was an article in the New York Times 3 weeks ago where they said, why isn't there any talk about one state for two people? Because nobody wants to hear it, at least here in Israel. Nobody wants to talk about it. I'm glad that here in Zechot, in the event, people talk about it. But we can all see how rare this kind of opening is. Now, also, I don't need to tell the people how ongoing the Nakba process was. It certainly wasn't an event. It was an ongoing theme that continues. And certainly we have to Judaize the Galilee and make everything Jewish, and the literature and the education, and really give the best fruits of the Zionist enterprise in that reality here in Israel today. But in terms of psyche, in terms of awareness, the fake awareness, which is clearly maintained here in Israel, I mean, where do these Palestinian refugees need to go? Where are we asking them to come? I think I think this is really nice. So I think you should show you. This is a poster by Tartakover, David Tartakover, a very famous Israeli artist, and he wiped out the words that weren't true. So the question is, ladies and gentlemen, if it's so important, and here I'm talking to those same groups that still see themselves as Zionist left, or think that Israelis, we want a Jewish a right to self-definition, and all those values that we were raised on. And we want to fix Israel, to fight the conquest and fight discrimination, and maybe bring the refugees to their homes, maybe the 200,000, maybe the actual people who are still alive. I think I think this sobering process brings us to the awareness that in the current political reality of our lives, where everything is so well planned and well organized, and where we cannot in any way undermine our right to discriminate, our right to destroy, our right to demolish. And there are so many people, so wonderful people in Israel, that would come to any protest and would help, and they don't want anybody to be taken from anybody's home and so forth. But stop and think for a moment, what is the upper mechanism that allows this reality to exist and maintains it? And so our path is that the return of the refugees means that we cannot believe in a Jewish state for the Jews. And we talked about the fundamental laws that lie at the heart of every nation. I don't want to talk about the legislation in Israel, but everybody here knows, according to their citizenship, according to their partisanship, if their passport, if they are citizens because of a right of return, or a citizen because they are residents, or because they're Jews and their grandparents have been Jews for generations into the past. So the right of return means that you may be allowed to come back here, but you're not allowed to bring your family members and so forth. So there's an entire, the Al-Dala, by the way, website. You can look at all of the many restrictions and terms and conditions that are specified there if you want to look at the specifications limiting right of return. You can also open the Haaretz newspaper. There is an article by Jacobson. He's an enormous advocate for the two states for two nations model, and he again returns and says that the right of return is the eradication of Israel. Now this is a sentence that you hear all the time. The meaning that we don't want the Palestinian refugees to come here because this will certainly undermine the overprivileged status of the Jews here. Now anybody who went to school here knows that we have a political system that has, and Al-Samab Abu-Sita, I agree with everything he says. We are an enormous military base. This is certainly true, but more than that, our military is the most symbolic central icon of our country. And so we offer as a group, as a movement. There's also a group in Haifa, and there's one in Ramallah, there's one in Gaza. We believe, and we also, this bipartisanship, and I don't want to talk only about bi-nationalism, and I would say that Jeff Halper talked about a bi-national country as a model. I only propose that you read Eli Aminov's articles. I think that would be something very interesting where he explains how much a bi-national country is simply another cover for the next phase of the Zionist enterprise, but we can't get into that at the moment, because the moment that we are identified according to our religion, and here I agree with Dr. Hemp, I'm not just identified by religion. I'm not just a Jew. I am a Jew, certainly. My children are Jewish, but this doesn't mean that I don't have other things that are more important to me in my life, that my neighbors in Jaffa and myself, we have completely common interests, regardless of our religions. I want to show you another personal story. This is the Kofshim Street on the corner of Malal in Tel Aviv. This parking lot was where my grandmother used to live, and we have a family mythology that says that grandmother was a great big hero. In 1948, she didn't leave her house, meaning the entire Kerem Teimanim neighborhood in Tel Aviv was completely empty. There was war, people were running away, people were scared, but because my grandmother her children were fighting in the war, she didn't leave. She was really, really heroic. But the other side of the story is that all of the Arabs left and didn't come back. And in Manshia, all of the non-Jewish families, I'm trying to simplify this thing and say how easy it is. People went back, they never were allowed to return, and they're still refugees till this very day. And I think the absentee property law it's already been specified this morning. I don't need to talk about nobody asked. The law, it ostensibly says that people who have left the land of Israel while it was held by the Israeli forces or fought against the inner forces has no right of return. Nobody asked the Yemenite Jews that lived next door to my grandmother whether they returned or didn't return. And this is also a very interesting picture that debunks a very strong myth here in Israel. Amos Oz, the author, said once that when he was a little boy, he understood the Jewish fear of pogroms, because massacres, and he knew that he, as a child, growing up in Tel Aviv, he knew that because people knew that Jews lived in that house, should they leave the house would be demolished by the Arabs. And here in the caption shot it says the violence of Tel Aviv 1947, but somebody wrote in Hebrew Arab house, and next to it it says Jewish home and Jewish property, and a Star of David, meaning somebody marked this house, and it certainly wasn't an Arab. A Jew walked along these streets and marked these houses as Jewish, and certainly these weren't Arab gangs, and they certainly weren't rioters. Now, another point that, if I have just one minute to say, and I think that always when we talk about the right of return, we shouldn't talk about as a real estate issue. There were Palestinians who had houses. There were Jews that had houses. There were many people who didn't have houses. The return of real estate is part of the story. It's part of the possession story, sure, certainly. But the expulsion and the return means talking about people's rights to return to their area. It could have been a work immigrant that came to the Al-Karmel, to the Tel Aviv area, and worked in the market for 2 years. And maybe they still have the right to be here. The problem is not who was expelled, but who believes that they are the only ones who have the right to live here. And finally, I was asked specifically to show you a practical solution to the refugees. Well, I think what could have been practical, here is the Tel Aviv central bus station, a disgusting, ugly site that hopefully will be demolished one day. It has 3,000 apartments there. Now, why don't we demolish it and have 3,000 apartments for refugees? Meaning, what kind of a story is this? How can we sit here and plan the return? What we need is a political body, a political mechanism that can shape such solutions. And don't even ask me where the money will come from, because again, I don't need to say that after hearing the lecture from Salman who talked about the money as well, and he saved me the time to talk about it. The Sudanese? Yes, when we have a government and we have free elections, then we can do that. We can reach there, we can change the regime. This is our vision, this is our aspiration. We are not a large group. We believe that the first stage should be the declaration that there should be a seminal meeting, because the state of Israel will not rise to its feet and do this. It was not established in a legal fashion, and from here on out, it won't happen obviously tomorrow, but I think that as a psychic or awareness issue, if somebody allows this idea to grow, it can grow, and it does have a possibility to be moved forward and become a reality. And we in Ramallah are going to have a meeting on the 2nd of October, and the Yafa group and the Ramallah group. It's an international conference that I hope will be as successful as this event. And some of us are also participating in the municipal elections in Jaffa and trying to get a Jewish Arab campaign going there. Shukran. Thank you very much to Ofra.
Some people think that the personal story will remain a very influential one. The next talk will be by Chaim Dorel-Lusky about multiplicity of languages as an example for multiplicity of identities in post-utopia. He is a lecturer in the Tel Aviv University, a philosopher and an artist, and he is a doctor of French philosophy, and he's writing a new doctorate on Jewish philosophy in the Prophet Amos, and he has published many books. The last one is Reality Trauma and the Internal Rationale of Photography. And this book was published a short while ago. He was born in Tel Aviv. Thank you very much.
I would like to say, first of all,
that some of the ideas have been formulated earlier with Shaul Setten, and I hope I won't disrupt his insights too much. We started out by formulating the thought about the Nakba, which is at the center of the Palestinian cause, the cause Palestinian, and the argument is that the Nakba once again comes up as a realistic historic event that is continuing to proceed. The time has frozen sometimes between November 29th, 47 and May 15th or 14th, 48, the day of the declaration of the State of Israel. We look at the picture of the consciousness that has been frozen at a devastating date, and a date to which a new kind of entity was etched in the human body. It is Odysseus' scar, the Nakba, that was etched in the consciousness of those who became refugees on that very same day, just like we heard a minute ago, but not only them. And that's exactly the point. As we learn time and again from other historic situations like war, the situation of being refugees, not a historic situation. It is not subject to dialectics. Not only that it doesn't change in a way that its memory is eroded and grows, but it increases in a way that receives a different dimension, a conceptual one, in comparison to the tens of thousands of refugees whom nobody counted, as they say colloquially in Hebrew at the time, and much less than the relative coverage that the people in Syria receive today. The Nakba is a universal issue, which is a proportion in thinking a certain dimension for resistance against the forces of history. And the lecture we saw from Boston is merely one example, an excellent one. And not only are there courts all over the world that deal with the crimes of 1948, but the position itself has been taken out of its particular place and is involved in anything that seeks to understand what reality is today, how does reality operate, how can it be fixed. So it is perspective in the Nietzschean sense, because through it we can look at the entire compound of life and history, not just the history of the conflict, to internalize it into the writing body and to turn it into a part of ourselves. Even if we have no personal or institutional or historic or religious connection to be from a Nakba or being a Nakba is not a Palestinian issue only. It is a basic concept that can serve anyone at any time in order to understand himself. This is my point of departure, to think about it as a formative idea and not just through the regular material language that came up with this concept and thinks about it in Arabic. And this is the perspective I took upon myself, what Deleuze and Guattari would call becoming language. The Nakba today is not in Arabic, it is becoming language. It is a language that's not Hebrew, neither Arabic, through which anyone can understand his situation differently than he did before. A Japanese person, a Chinese person, anyone can understand himself differently through this concept of Nakba. The becoming language Nakba, or becoming Nakba, is an elephant that can lead thought to think how can we proceed to an option that will talk about restitution, the realization of transitional justice, not as a political abstraction, but as a reality, to get down into all the nitty-gritty details and not just how to return the property that was lost, but also where will they come back to as far as occupation, their working conditions, what will they work in, or especially as far as the linguistic and educational settings that they will speak and educate their children according to. So the question is, what is the content of this return? Not only we talked about the return quite a lot today, but what is the content that will characterize and populate this return? What is the content of the class and the work? We haven't spoken enough about classes today. What is the content of education, of the religious radicalization that has occurred in the past 60 years? We're not against this religious radicalization. We need to go with it, and especially to utilize the conceptual dimension and to think through it, how not to fall into modernist national settings during the return, as we saw some less modernist attempts earlier, and to establish a state that, for me, the main thing about it, that it is not a nation state. We must understand that the beginning of this state is not in the modern modern subject that led to the nation state or the European democracy that has developed at the late 18th or 19th century in France and England, but rather the Nakba concept as a basic platform for new political thinking on top of the issue of just political and historical correction and redress. So my basic argument regarding this new situation is that the concern of the cause Palestinian is different than the basic refugee issue that is embodied in the term Nakba, because it cannot end with the end of the occupation or expulsion and the beginning of the era of return. That means that the Nakba won't end if, let's say, everybody comes back and everything will be all nice and well, because it does not depend on existential questions or political situation. That means it is not influenced at all by the events of Bibi or Barak, Rabin or Arafat, because it is beyond history and politics. The Nakba is an idea, an ideal, something that enables us to distinguish between the historic, the metaphysical, and the political. It's something that positions thought about something, distinguish between the phenomena and the essence. The phenomena is the expulsion, the essence is the Nakba. The concept of the subject, it is an archimedical point, the Nakba, which identifies me as somebody who is a Nakba, just as the I, the concept of the I or the subject or the Ich, was in the past related to a subject or the development of citizenship or the concepts of rationalism in modern thought or the concepts of enlightenment. Just as the I in the past, in the modern era, had a consciousness, the I in this era, I don't have a consciousness. I have a Nakba which replaces my consciousness, that tells me that being a refugee, being without protection, being without something, without a home, without defense, without rights, without a homeland, and lacking capital, lacking organizations that will protect me. This is my basic situation that distinguishes me as a basis to what will erase the national differences. And in this respect, it is the Jew or the division that was suggested here by religious Jews or Jews and Palestinians or so I cannot accept this division. On the contrary, there's something that runs much deeper and unites everything and makes all the modernist partitionings and divisions redundant and being occupied or being an occupier. This is a joint, a mutual victimhood situation created by colonialism. So being Nakba, the other opposite of that is being a citizen. I do not accept the continuation of citizenship or the democratic revolution as the future of the common state. First of all, we need to identify once again the communal aspect, the private one, just like in the maps we saw earlier. And it goes along with this thing, with this suggestion to bring back the place and there to begin to generate the work. And what I suggest is that instead of wanting a freedom or liberties that are part of the problem, but they're not part of the solution to the problem. The community that accepts the common concept of Nakba seeks first and foremost to strive to study the text before anything else, the discourse of the Nakba, as a source for sharing. This is their common experience, not if they're Jews or Muslims and Christians or if they're Israelis or Palestinians, but this is the experience that unites them above and beyond the modernist distinctions of nationality and identity and religion. So I seek to present the activity of the world. The concept of the Palestinian problem that goes beyond the place 48 or 67 has become a universal term in the language of a French philosopher, Alain Badiou, which has an ontological aspect that deals with another aspect of the problem. Now I go to another philosopher, an Italian philosopher, somebody else who works in this area, Georges Agamben, and he was an Italian philosopher. He wrote several books that looks at a different understanding of the history in which we live. Agamben uses the concept of camp. This is the basic concept that he uses, and we understand. In contrast to the concept of the camp, I suggest the Nakba, which replaces the camp concept, and it's very different to my own camp concept. If we look into his argument, in case you're not familiar with him, and maybe some of you are not, I can say that for him, for Agamben, the concept of camp is not just a closed compound, a territory where you collect people for whom the law has become a suspended law, just like in a refugee camp. But a camp becomes a hidden matrix of the political sphere in which we currently live. That means we are all people who live in a camp camp, we live a life that is an exposed life, as he calls it, because we're all exposed to a situation in which the law could become suspended for us at any given moment. For example, in Israel, due to the security situation or a declaration of war, etc., regardless of the sequence of events of our alleged life in the liberal world. For example, the Prover law of today, that's a very good example for the camp situation, but the Prover law applies to people who are in the camp, but the Bedouins have been in the camp a long time ago, but if they apply the Prover law to you and me, that's a different situation, and that day is not far off. And I think it's a possible situation if we look at the economy and education, etc. The citizenship in this situation of the exposed life, when we all potentially become exposed as citizens, in the sense that we're all part of what he calls the biopower, the management of the biopower of the state in the modern era, which today, and this is something he didn't reach, through the alleged civilian mechanisms, as we've seen what has happened with Google and the exposure of our emails, etc., Twitter, or of course Facebook, which is the mechanism of the postmodern camp, which is allegedly very free and enables a communal life, but it's just like a camp in which our life is completely exposed, as if by our own free will, as if we donate our exposure. But the way I see it, he wasn't exactly accurate. He left this concept too vague in many places, and therefore, if we add to that concept of base or camp, we add the concept of Nakba. And in the Nakba, there is no suspension of the law that existed in the refugee camp that Agamben looked at. These are the concentration camps and the DP camps post-1945 in Europe. In Agamben's discussion, there is no sufficient treatment of the issue of language when we understand the role of spoken language in the camp. That is not similar from one camp to another, and the roles change. Therefore, there is no camp, as we kept talking about refugee camps. In the place of the Nakba, there are no camps. There are named Jelazun, Shuafat, Jabalia, Al Yarmouk, Balata, Dahesha, Kalandia, Shati, Nusra, Dir al Balak, etc. So in my discussion, I am reversing the ideas of Zochot, because Zochot, they remember the villages that used to be in the land of Israel. And what I suggest is that we need to start remembering the refugee camps that exist today, because Zochot in some way created, in a dialectical way, Zochot remembers the villages that were demolished in Israel, and all the maps that we see in all this work, this sacred work that they do, is all about what happened here. But through the concept of Nakba, we are reversing things wrong, and we create a mirror image. We create the Zochot of today's refugee camps. Today there are 66 such camps, at least the way I counted it. And whenever the liberty appears, that's the liberty of that specific camp. The Nakba of Nusrat is not the Nakba of Jabalia, just like we saw in the maps, and the Nakba of Shuafat is not the Nakba of Balata, etc. The liberty keeps appearing in the concept of a Nakba, which is not a stable one, just like the camp concept of Agamben. So there's a multiplicity in the discourse of language. So instead of becoming Nakba Shuafat or becoming Nakba Jabalia, there's a present of a different question of resistance generated by the specific language, present through the memory that the language creates through the memory, a memory that is created thanks to the 65 years that people have lived in this place. They have a becoming Nakba Shuafat, which is very different than to the becoming Nakba Jabalia, because of the 65 years of memory they lived in, and we do not wish to erase that. And this is what the discussion, in my opinion, so far hasn't internalized yet, because so far the discussion was about, do we or don't we want to come back? How will they come back? What kind of a transitional justice will we give them? But it didn't address the accumulated justice of 65 years that, the way I see it, has turned them into a becoming Nakba Shuafat that's very different from becoming Nakba Jabalia, etc., etc. Just like what happened in the Lebanon War with Sabra and Shatila. So the becoming Nakba, Sabra and Shatila is very different than any other becoming. And indeed, the way I see it, and here I'm reversing the issue of defenseless according to Gamben, Chaim, I think you need to begin to wrap up. Yes, I'll try. It's just my third section, but I'll try to. Their defenselessness is different from one camp to another. That's the idea of language, because their defenselessness through the language that they've developed, the language becomes a means of power. The language which is spoken in that becoming Nakba Shuafat becomes a dimension of a force. And the language there is a linguistic event, a conceptual event that undermines time and again the fixation of the state of emergency. It undermines the power of the ruler, the occupier, the person who expels, because becoming Nakba Shuafat or becoming Nakba el-Khilwe, for me, this is an event in which the sovereign has lost his right to manage liberty, because during these 65 years, he did not decide on the situation in which they live and speak, even though it started out of its declaration of a state of emergency. So the outcome of this Nakba or Nakbas presents the sovereign as helpless. The state of Israel, which is always presented as being very powerful, is one big military base. If we think about it through the reversal of the language, which I suggest becomes just as weak as the weakness that we attribute to the refugees. Since the concept of the speaker, in this case an Arab speaker, through the language that is constantly being spoken in these places, in these camps, that becomes the area, the regional defense of these places. It says that not only that the citizens of the Nakba weren't weak all these 65 years, weren't defenseless, but in many respects it is vice versa. As far as the language that exists within the camp, they've created the new force that's called becoming Nakba Shuafat, which we come to conceptualize here as a basis for the situation, which I call the post-utopic situation. But the utopic relationship that Agamben presents through the discussion of the camp and the Musulman, the Nakba stops being a place like the camp, but rather becomes an event, a situation. And unlike the camp, it is a particular situation that in every case created the resistance towards becoming the concept of Nakba like today, which is a universal term that, in my view, makes the entire thinking an aversion to this topic of the grand sovereignty that has the name of Israel, makes all that redundant. Thank you very much. Thank you. Shukran.
والمحاضرة الأخيرة في هذه الجلسة هي بعنوان مجتمع سلام في إسرائيل.
On the topic of a peace society in Israel-Palestine. Society of peace is possible in Israel-Palestine. A proposal for a new political order. We'd like to hear Dr. Ariela Shadmi talk about this subject, please.
يلا أريلا شدمي هي ناشطة من أجل المرأة والسلام وضد العنصرية.
Ariela Shadmi has fought against racism and today is an activist in the organizations Women in Black and Achoti. She founded women's organizations in Jerusalem and heads the Department for Gender in Beit Berl, and has published many books like Thinking as a Woman that was published in 2007. Peace is not the final act of war. Peace is not an agreement. Peace is the ways in which we conduct ourselves daily towards creation, towards nature. Peace is the ways of our lives, our daily lives, and it is our possibility to choose and implement constantly. We choose a life of a partnership and caring. Therefore, we would like to outline the characteristics of a society of peace. Once we know the outlines, then it will be understood that it is not just a different paradigm, but actually a change of consciousness. And therefore, maybe some people will think that it is naive and disregard it. Yet, I hope it will open to a new kind of discourse and new options. we, Israelis and Palestinians, who face a new dawn. This is what I believe. An opportunity has been given to us to create a different kind of world, because the peace agreements, as we've known them so far, between Israel, Palestine, Egypt, and Jordan, are incapable of and don't even try to liberate us from the true tyrants, which are religiousness, nationalism, patriarchy, capitalism, the so-called enlightenment. When all these force us to accumulate, to consume, to oppress, to work tirelessly, and to be in conflicts, as all this exists, we have an opportunity to create a different kind of society, a society of peace. In my presentation, I am influenced by several sources of inspiration that are completely different to the discourse that's been presented here all day long. I am talking about sources of inspiration, all of which, except for one, are completely non-Western, and which and come from the global South mainly, except for maybe one or two. The first source is the economy of giving. The economy of giving is something that constantly exists beneath the capitalist economy which we know, and it is exploited by that economy, but it also exists everywhere. Their economy that responds, the economy of the mother that responds to the call and the needs of the baby, but also gifts of nature and knowledge, etc. Another source of inspiration for me is the matriarchal legacy, societies of peace and true equality that coexist among us nowadays, in which we deny, just as we deny the Nakba, like the Morsu in China and the Minangkabau in Indonesia, and societies which had existed in the pre-patriarchal era. In matriarchies, women are at the center of the culture without dominating the other members of the community. The purpose is not to gain power over others and power over nature, but rather to foster and nurture the natural life and cultural life based on mutual respect. Another source is a contemporary indigenous thinking, and I wish to emphasize out of the great wealth of this thinking two concepts, one of which at least is known, and that is Gandhi's, the concept used by Gandhi. He invented Tamal, tell me if I'm saying it right, Satyagraha, and the meaning of this concept according to Gandhi is the power of truth, the power of the soul, a non-violent measure for conflict resolution. And of course we know this from the South African model. Another very important concept, just as important, is that of Ubuntu. I exist or I am because I belong, or I belong therefore I am. This is a key African concept. A person is made a person. A human is made a human through other humans, and all of humanity is based on connections and a deep interdependency. And right, a privilege never exists at the expense of the community, and the community never harms the autonomy of the individual. Another source of inspiration is the perspective of existence, or the subsistence perspective. It is a worldview that goes beyond the economy, and which suggests that the capitalistic goal of producing products will be replaced with that of satisfying human needs. And this goal has nothing to do with money and commodities, but rather with life production. The concept of needs once again comes up here, just as the concept of needs. I mean, it is very important because since it recognizes the fact that our planet, our Earth, is limited. We cannot all live at the level of consumption and use of resources as men in the first world live. In order to obtain life and liberty for all, we need to recognize the needs and the restrictions of nature. Current spiritualism is my fifth source of inspiration. The approaches I've presented so far build the option of a society which connects between the spiritual and the social. And I call this daily spiritualism. Any creature, whether a living or plant, has concern. The interconnectedness between the individual and the community in the world and the environment is all deeply rooted in human existence. And finally, I draw from the Jewish heritage that in its history, the community with the values of mutual responsibility, even though not in the matriarchal sense, was a very significant key element. And these sources of inspiration that go beyond the popular Western approaches share a set of values and structures and conduct that are based on completely different concepts, not equality. I mean, ultimately, it will reach equality and democracy, but the concepts are needs, community life, containment, spiritualism, reconciliation, and balance. Together, they lead to the option of the existence of a different society, which is the basis for the political order which I shall try to present here, and the alternative political order that's based on these sources of inspiration is based on containment, on a system of local communities, common spaces, balance, and a consensus democracy. Now, these sets of concepts is completely outside the Western box. And Western thought, I find it to be useless and lacking purpose. So what I suggest for the area between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River is based on the following elements. Since my view rejects the concept of other and is willing to discuss the expanded family like Gandhi did, everybody will participate in an equal way. Ashraf, the PLO, Hamas, settlers, Zionists, women, men, transgenders, people with or without identities, with or without definitions. Because the intimate community enables belonging. According to Ubuntu's concept, it enables responsibility and belonging and a sense of confidence, and the society will not be based on the concept of state, which I definitely reject, and definitely I reject the nation state, but rather a network of sovereign and local communities that have economic freedom and autonomy, that talk about the common denominator they all have, and it can be based on identity. For example, Christian Palestinians, Jewish ultra-Orthodox, Jews, Orthodox Muslims, or based on an ideological affiliation, etc. And of course, this corresponds with what we heard from Jeff in Boston. It corresponds with it very strongly, and it makes it very practical because we have some living examples. I mean, some people live like that today. I'm going to visit them in Colombia in 5 months' time. Anyhow, these communities form together a certain entity, but not, and even a state entity, but not a nation state as we know, but rather a state that has no more than minimal administrative roles. Every community will be autonomous but open to others, and will show respect to all other communities, and will have the ability to exist on its own, as long as nationality and state are perceived to be important. And I think that they still are perceived to be important in light of the common discourse both in Israel and in Palestine, as long as the local communities will be associated with regional identities, for example, Israeli and Palestinian, at least for those who want it. I mean, the communities will be able to choose. I think in Jeff's proposal as well, this option had existed, and all of them together will be part of the state framework. The belonging of the local communities to a national identity does not require common territorial borders, but a common consciousness. Rather, every community will be able to choose the national identity it wishes to belong to, or to remain independent. A religious community like the ultra-Orthodox community will maintain its characteristics based on its decision. if it's their own internal decisions, even if they do not respect women and civil rights. And believe me that as a feminist, I find this sentence which I'm uttering to be a very difficult one, but I think it should be like that, because change won't come from external pressure or coercion like Yair Lapid is trying to do, but through dialogue with these communities and the awakening of women in various sectors. Okay, just 2 minutes left, Harela. Since this is the end of the day, they're cutting us short. Just a few more minutes, please. Every community will live within its own possibilities and will prevent overexploitation of its resources, and it will manage to have a collective economy and local production of food. The balance between the communities, that's very important, will be created in the following measures. First of all, between the local communities, various common public spheres, both virtual and geographic, in which the decisions will be decided, and they'll be decided in a consensual way. There will be a common agenda for the region, or shared by several regions, that will all be discussed there. Of course, conflict resolution will only be done in non-violent ways, through listening cycles and restorative justice and community policing. And another thing that's important, and not a lot of people know about it in Israel, regional, communal, and state decision-making will only be achieved through consensus. And don't tell me that it's difficult. I mean, anybody who knows this, anybody who was educated on this, it's not difficult, it's possible. And it's possible today with the internet, even amongst very large population groups. And thus a very much more deeper democracy will be obtained that transcends over Western democracy. And the balancing of resources and relations, the society will be based on layers of various relations, and there could be multiple affiliations. For example, I can live in one community, but I can belong to another community, let's say gender community or a peace community or any other community. There will be a multiple economy, control over resources of different communities. I mean, the resources can be within the community, but it will share them. Let's say a resource such as the Mediterranean, yes? Perhaps there will be nearby communities, but it will belong to everyone. Power is cooperatively shared, and that's very important in matriarchal societies. And sharing other communities in festivities and occasions while using the economy of giving instead of accumulation. Accumulation is a key capitalist concept. And let me just say something regarding the right of return, that such a program opens different options for the realization of the right of return, which also suits what was presented here from Boston. For example, we can establish communities of people in their historic places, or places that are currently not populated, in local places between the Jordan River and the sea. They can join other communities and their affiliations. And the process there is, I mean, it takes time. It's procedural. It's not immediate. For example, you don't need to dismantle mountains for that. You don't need to break down cities for that. We know that there are various communal groups within cities today. There could be urban communities and non-urban communities. The process will be of devising urban communities. I think this is part of the process for agreeing on compensation for refugees and who gives them, and the establishment of listening circles and shared truth circles and other means. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you. We will give about 10 minutes Perhaps if there are any questions or comments, I hope there won't be too many questions, but rather if people would like to voice their opinions. We don't have much time left for that, only 10 minutes. Please. If anybody wishes to speak, try and make it brief and to the point. Since you are allowing us to say a word, it's more about responding than asking, because there won't be time to provide answers to the questions. I would like to share something, what I feel as a historian, as a history teacher, as a social philosopher. Perhaps you can introduce yourself. My name is Dov Koller. I'm a teacher and an educator. I live in Karmel, and we have a joint group, a Jewish and Arab group that we're running for city council, and that's just a bonus. What I'm saying is that the Nakba, it's something that goes way back. It didn't start and didn't end with 48, 49, and anybody who's a bit interested in politics can see this daily, and it's quite shocking. I mean, anybody who has a heart and a consciousness and knows a bit about the history, especially the history of the Jewish people now. My late father, he fought against the Nazis. He liberated the concentration camps, took care of the DPs and the refugees. So the entire moral sentiment that worked in favor of these people is quite obvious. The fact that my father's generation, my generation, the fact that we created here some kind of a crime, a major crime, regretfully, against the Palestinian people, and today there are sufficient historic studies that indicate that it was planned, and there was the Daliet plan, and there were some activities that were planned, and there were Jews who also objected to these. But what we did here is very, very serious. And I say, I mean, as a historian, when I looked at it, what happened, and we need to get organized. All these people who object to what the State of Israel did, and even those who are victims of the State of Israel, whether it's the Palestinians, the Palestinian Bedouins, or the Jews, we're not willing to continue with this. We all need to group together and to take some action, some radical action, and we need to take over Yad Vashem, the Yad Vashem Museum in Jerusalem, and we need to say in Yad Vashem, guys, the State of Israel is betraying the memory of what you've been through. That's it. Thank you. Please speak to the mic. This is for the sake of the interpretation. Until you reach the mic, you can get there and wait in line. My name is Alia Strauss. I'm an activist in Women in Black and Mahsom Watch and the Women's Coalition for Peace. What I haven't heard in all the discussions and what scares me as somebody who came from the US originally is the memory or the knowledge I have on what's what the American society today is. 150 years ago, Abraham Lincoln liberated the slaves. And today, there's democracy in the U.S. And every vote, one vote for every citizen, does that mean that we have equality in the U.S.? No, not at all. Absolutely not. The African Americans could not be equal to the European Americans. And to this very date, they still haven't reached equality, despite the fact that there's a president who's an African American. What scares me is that if there's one state there will be a community, there will be here or a method, or an apartheid method, because because the Palestinian economy is much, much weaker than the Israeli economy. And even if we declare a democracy, that declaration doesn't change reality so quickly, and we somehow need to also address the economic aspect. Thank you. Ariella has an answer, but we'd like to hear two more questions by the people standing there next to the mic. He was there before, but never mind. We're talking about democracy and coexistence and living in one state.
First of all, I'd like to thank Zakrot for organizing this conference. My name is Ali Kazak. I was born in Haifa, and I was about 10 months old when a Nakba took place, and I became a refugee with my mother. My father stayed in Haifa, and when Israel was created, we were denied our right to reunite with my father. So I grew up in Syria, and later on I immigrated to Australia, and I became a Palestine ambassador to Australia and the Pacific. I saw my father for the first time after 48 years, after the Oslo Accord. All my life, I worked for a solution based on coexistence. I joined Fatah when I was a student in Damascus University in 1968. Fatah was still underground at the time. And we were working for one-state solution where Jews, Christians, and Muslims live together equally. So just in short, I think that we should not kid ourselves. The so-called two-state solution, the peace process, is just deceitful to all of us. I think we should shorten the agony and the pain and work together. I used to always, when I used to be invited to address gatherings in Australia, especially on universities and so on, we used to have slogans. And this is in Fatah, what we learned in Fatah. We had a number of slogans. We learned, one, that our final victory would not be achieved on our own. Our final victory will be achieved hand in hand with the Jewish people against the common enemy, Zionism. And excuse me, I'm just emotional a bit, so excuse me for that. So we always identified that, hand in hand with the Jews against common enemy Zionism. And so I think this is what should be achieved. And this is fact of life. And I think anyone who cannot see the common enemy will be absolutely kidding themselves and blind and lying and deceiving themselves. I believe that it is time that we have a movement, as was suggested by some speakers, where based on Palestinians and Israelis to work seriously for the creation of a solution. I think we are clever enough to find a solution acceptable to both sides, to solve both sides. Jews or Israelis say Jerusalem, their capital. Palestinians want Jerusalem, their capital. There are Jews who want to live in the West Bank. West Bank to them is more important than Haifa. So, and Palestinian refugees want to return to Haifa and Jaffa. So therefore, a solution can be and should be, and I think that we have enough support to have both sides to see and realize that one state can address all issues. We can have confederation between them. We can have, as was suggested, where two parliaments with a joint council. I mean, solutions can be found.
نعم.
And to satisfy both. And thank you very much.
واضحة الفكرة. شكرا. هاي حدك في رفيق درب عنيد في هاي القضية. إلي. عزيز إلي.
אני לא מקבלת כלום.
טוב, אני רציתי להתייחס לדברים של אריאלה שדמי.
Well, I wanted to refer to what Ariela Shadmi said. She had a great plan. Sadly, it cannot be implemented in current reality. In order to change current reality, we have to do several things that are a bit more serious. I say this very sadly. We have to establish one political party of Jews, Arabs. It doesn't matter who is included in this party, that will fight for a democratic secular state and for the right of return. Afterwards, in the secular democratic state that we establish, we can get a different kind of democracy, not a democracy that is limited to 4 years, but people that can be replaced whenever they need to be replaced. And then we can also include such plans. Before that, it will never work. This is my opinion. Okay, thank you very much. And now to
طيب خلينا نعطيها بس تجاوب على لأنه سئلت بشكل مباشر وننهي بما تريد أن تعبر فيه عن رأيك. لحظة بس تفضلي يا ريل.
עליה, אני חושבת שאת צודקת שאת אומרת שההצעות פה לא התייחסו לכלכלה.
These declarations won't refer only to economy and to the repression of women and minorities. I think that my proposal really touches on this issue directly and on the basis of historic, multifaceted reality. And just like we like to ignore a Nakba, we like to ignore that heritage as well from societies that live this way till this day in several places around the world, and we refuse to look at it. And these examples are living examples. Now, even if we don't implement this exactly the same, Eli, I simply do not accept that we first establish a democracy and a political party. I think that let's first establish and understand the other possibilities that we have before us, and not according to the regular democratic Western route that only stops us. Obama and Holland, and there are more obstacles than they are an aid to us. What do I need them for? I don't need them. I want the alternative. And I think it's possible, it's feasible, and we can think in other terms. Now, I met Dov. I met him on the internet through the tent protest, and we talked about this very thing, about regional organizations in which are establishing regional economy, regional organizations. I constantly talk about this. I didn't have time to talk about this in details, but subsistence economy is something that's feasible and it's completely different, and it's totally doable. And what I propose is, let's start thinking in a different paradigm. Let's only remain in the same Western paradigm. This kind of democracy, that kind of democracy, or any kind of those solutions that you offer. I don't want capitalism anymore. What for? Or with a patriarchal rule. I don't need this. Thank you very much.
تكون الكلمة الأخيرة تختتم فيها هاي الجلسة بس بسرعة البرق.
But very quickly we should move on. Thank you very much. I waited for you 65 years and you didn't come back to me. You come from Lifta. I came from Lifta to this conference, and I wanted to hear what people had to say. I want to come back with my children, whether to Lifta or anywhere else, just like 620 Arab villages as well. That's the redemption, if you would. Not Netanyahu, not anybody else. This won't give me a livelihood. This won't give me back my soul. There's nothing that will reconcile me on the loss of my history, on the loss of my house, on the loss of my father, who is buried in Lifta, and my grandmother and my grandfather, all of them. This will not reconcile me. I don't want a reconciliation. I want to come back to Lifta, to my home. But not under conquest and not under Israeli regime, but under the authority of a democratic state from river to sea. We will create this together, all of us, under democratic rule in which we will all return to, where nobody is above anybody else, and it's neither capitalist and not colonial, and it's not imperialist, and it's not the US and nobody else. We, us, the people here together, will create it, and we can create our own lives and shape them and direct them by implementing justice among us as people, as human beings. And I believe that my father, my grandfather who lived here, whether Jewish or Muslims or Christians, it doesn't matter, they were all Palestinians. They were all Palestinians. And I say, this is Palestine, this makeup, we are all Palestinians, that includes whether Jewish Palestinians or Christian or Muslim. But it has to do with anything of the global imperialist rule that created the problem, but rather that we have been expelled, voiceless, possessions stolen, and the redress will be that we come back to our homes, to our dignity,
وأعتقد أن هذا الكلام هو خير ما نختتم به هذه الجلسة. شكرا لعفرة أريلا وحايم على مداخلاتهم الجميلة والمفيدة جدا، وإلى اللقاء في الساعة 6 تبدأ الجلسة الأخيرة لهذا اليوم. شكرا لكم.
When we begin the last session for the day. Thank you.
Okay.
يلا اهلا عفرة تدعم كيف בסדר, לא חשוב, אני הייתי הקורבן, אה?
כן, אתה הקורבן.
למען הקיצור אני מבקש.